Jefferson Airplane on Dubai Eye 103.8. I'm Helen Farmer. Hope you're having an absolutely terrific Tuesday. You can make yourself comfortable. Prepare to be educated. It's the Psychology Hour now. Fantastic to have you with us. We are live on Facebook talking language and psychology this hour. Now, language is living, it's dynamic, it is ever-changing. The language of today isn't the same as 100 years ago, 50 years ago, probably even 5 years ago in some areas. And the language and concepts of different professions flow into our everyday language. We often end up using terms frequently. Social media, TV plays a role in this. And we're talking about psychological concepts that have entered your everyday language that you might not even have noticed. From gaslighting to OCD, we're talking about what these terms really mean now with Dr. Thoraya, clinical psychologist at the Human Relations Institute and Clinic. Great to have you with us. And I know some of the words on this list you find particularly frustrating. Before we get to some of these words that have entered our kind of common parlance, our vernacular, and are being misused and perhaps misunderstood, Thoraya, the reason to my mind, and I'm very keen to get your take on this, is that our awareness around mental health has increased exponentially. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on the pros and cons of this?
Well, obviously the pros are massive, especially after COVID. I think a lot of people started taking mental health a lot more seriously. And, and I talk about this quite a bit. I don't really like the term mental health because it separates from physical health, whereas in fact they are one. However, we use it because it's part of our vernacular now. The cons of it, however, is that a lot of people are misusing so many psychological terms, or they're misdiagnosing people and others. And I've had stories that come at me where people are calling others by diagnostic terms just haphazardly.
And this might be based off something they've said or a personality trait or a situation rather than it being a clinical diagnosis.
Correct. And all of our clinical diagnoses are clusters of symptoms. They're not just one behavior or a couple of things that are noticed, and they're usually seen pervasively over a long period of time, whereas people are using terms to indicate specific and eventful behaviors or words or situations, and that's extremely incorrect.
And this is community at large, but there are some people who are kind of self-appointed experts that and don't get me wrong, social media can be an incredible place for fostering mental health awareness, for creating communities and support and education. It really, really is. However, there's a lot of misinformation out there with people who have maybe done a short course, maybe not even done a short course, but they've changed their Instagram bio and are now an expert.
Yes.
Where do you, as a clinical psychologist with a doctorate, where do you see the dangers of this? And have you had clients come in saying, well, I saw this TikTok, so now my husband's a narcissist?
Right. I actually hear that quite a bit, not just from my clients, but even friends, family members, people that I know. Randomly, they talk about things. Oh, I saw this on TikTok or on this Instagram reel. And I'm just like, yes, great. Have you checked the credentials of the individual that you're watching? This is really important. And this, again, I don't want to be hypocritical and say that social media is bad, because it's not. I use it to educate people as well. Mm-hmm. But always check the credentials of the individual, because sometimes we also have individuals who suffer from a mental health disorder. And then all of a sudden they become the expert on talking about it. But that's not necessarily the case, because like I said, they're clusters of symptoms, and those clusters have many different types of permutations and connotations of what that could look like. So a person who's depressed may look very different from another person who's depressed. So they cannot be an expert just because they have the diagnosis themselves.
And this is across the board. This isn't just psychology and mental health. We see this in fitness professionals, skincare experts, parenting coaches, confidence coaches. And it's like, we were just talking about authenticity and storytelling with Becky Anderson from CNN, and she was saying exactly that. As consumers of information, we need to do a little bit of digging. And this is something we need to be training our kids and the next generation of, you know what, just if you Google it and it doesn't come up in the first 10 results, you can go past that. You can be checking sources and don't take anything as read. Self-diagnosis, is that something that you get people coming in with? And I've seen this in friends and kind of acquaintances of going, I'm suffering from anxiety. And I'm going, oh, or are you just a bit worried?
Right, right. And this is one thing that we forget, that the term anxiety has been taken from generalized anxiety disorder and then used haphazardly. And the reality is that if we just look at worrying or nervousness, it's actually a very healthy emotion for us to experience. However, generalized anxiety disorder, where anxiety actually comes from, is a disorder. And the reason why we call them disorders is because it creates disruption in the order of your life. And that means that you're experiencing consistent and intrusive worrying thoughts that you cannot control. It's causing a lot of internal physiological symptomology, and it's something that's constantly affecting you on a day-to-day basis. That's what anxiety is, not worrying and nervousness.
I'm a bit nervous about asking you this, though. Now, you work a lot with teens, adolescents, young people in the Human Relations Institute and Clinic. Oh, how am I going to say this? Have you found, trying to not make this a leading question, is there an element of tribalism, of wanting to have a label, wanting to feel like you belong, whether it is anxiety, depression, or all manner of diagnosable conditions?
I do. I see that it can be trendy to have a specific diagnosis, be it anxiety or depression and things like that. And they'll usually use those words that come in, oh, I have ADHD. And I'm like, okay, so where were you diagnosed? Oh, no. I just saw it on TikTok and I figured it out. I'm like, okay, interesting. So there are a lot of people that are trying to be a part of the new movement because it is talked about more now than ever before. And it's really important that we do talk about it, but it's also important for us to take a step back and recognize it for what it is rather than what we think it is.
We are next going to be talking about some of these terms that are misunderstood to an extent by a lot of people and certainly misused. I mean, that is in social media, it is in media, and it is in common conversation as well. Psychopath, narcissist, toxic. Dr. Thraya's personal bugbear, triggered. If you need clarification on any of these terms or indeed a situation that you are in, you're more than welcome to reach out and be completely anonymous. 4001 is the SMS. You can use the ARN Play app, and you've got the WhatsApp too. That's 04871 5500. We are decoding those terms and getting the correct diagnosis next.
More of Afternoons with Helen Farmer is coming up next.
On the UAE's #1, talking the best of British healthcare to the UAE.
It is 18 minutes past 4 and it's the Psychology Hour. Joining us in studio from the Human Relations Institute and Clinic, Dr. Thraya is with us, clinical psychologist, as we navigate some of the commonly used and often misused psychological terms. And I'm going to start with, I guess, one of the trendier ones, and viewers of Love Island out of the UK will certainly be familiar with gaslighting. Now, I've got no idea where this term came from. Maybe you know the origins of the word. But how can you explain what it is, Dr. Thraya? Maybe give us some examples and maybe some. Well, I've got a message from a listener who wants to get your take on what of her situation is gaslighting. So let's get a definition first.
So the definition of gaslighting is a psychological manipulation in order to confuse the person and make them doubt themselves and make them feel like their reality is incorrect. So basically the gaslighter is using a lot of different techniques and a lot of ways to influence the other person into thinking that their perception is incorrect and whatever they're saying is incorrect by denying a lot of the things that they've engaged in. Mm-hmm. Now, it's very important to recognize that gaslighting is very similar to bullying in the sense that it has to be persistent and consistent. It can't be a one-off. If it's a one-off, it could be a misunderstanding. It could be something that a person has said in the heat of anger. But gaslighting is that consistent and persistent pattern of behavior where a person is engaging in trying to get you to think that you're, essentially crazy. Mm-hmm. And that they are correct and they didn't actually do anything wrong. This can show itself in, for instance, you and I are having a conversation and I say something very mean to you. And then a few minutes later, you're like, I didn't really appreciate that you said that. I'm like, well, I didn't say that. Or you took it the wrong way, or you're just being a bit too sensitive.
Or I've seen this in a few situations, thankfully not mine, about a spouse having doubts about the fidelity of their partner. Mm-hmm. And when going to them saying, I've noticed this, or I have evidence of that, total denial, you're making it up, you're paranoid, you're insecure, this is about
Right. Exactly.
Now, I've had a couple of messages actually on gaslighting in particular. One come through social media, one on 4001. If you do want to get a bit of clarification or perhaps run a situation past Dr. T, you're more than welcome. You can be completely anonymous. A friend here is saying a good friend of 20 plus years has gone very quiet, never initiates contact and gives one-word replies to texts, makes excuses when asked to meet up. I've asked her directly what the matter is and she replied with nothing, all fine. It's clearly not. Would you describe this response as gaslighting?
I wouldn't necessarily describe this as gaslighting. What I would say is that clearly there's a resistance for the person to either have a conversation about what's going on. Maybe they don't have proper conflict resolution skills. Maybe they're very shy, whatever it is. But in that moment, they're not trying to make you feel like there's something wrong. Remember, I think, and this is very important, I usually stress this with all of my clients, even my interns, I tell them, no one can make you feel anything. You choose your emotions. No one has control over that. So if you're feeling a sense of discomfort, then you need to kind of look at where's that discomfort coming from. So if maybe the discomfort you're experiencing is more on the lines of you're feeling that this friendship isn't, two-way. It's very much one-sided. And then there are steps to be taken with that. And going back to my favorite B word, boundaries, right, need to be taken in that moment. But ultimately, that type of behavior cannot be described as gaslighting.
Let's go to a concerned parent now, and this came through earlier today, saying, thank you for this. Apparently, emotional gaslighting is when someone dismisses another person's feelings, implying them that they are unable to identify how they feel. Now, my husband has a habit of telling our daughter that things don't hurt all the time. I've told him too many times that he needs to listen to her. For example, if she says the water in the bath is too hot, he tells her it's not. It usually isn't. And I've said to him, she's the only one who can decide that. And it's her feelings, he needs to listen to her. I'm fed up of telling him he can't tell her how she feels or what hurts, but he doesn't seem to change. Is it gaslighting or is it just him being bad with feelings?
Well, I mean, again, because it's hard to decide quickly off of this example, but what I would say is that there's definitely a dismissal and an invalidation of the child's feelings, and it's important to recognize it. At the same time, we don't have to consistently validate everything and make everything true, because what we know about feelings, and this is coming from a psychologist, is that they are real and they're valid, but they're not factual. So yes, maybe she feels like the water is too hot. It doesn't mean the water is hot, but it doesn't mean that you have to dismiss or invalidate the feeling itself. So you could say, something on the lines of, I know that's how it's feeling. And you want to try again, maybe and try to maybe have conversations around it rather than just being like, no, it's
You're
not.
wrong.
Because that comes from a place of impatience and lack of empathy.
Yeah, I get the impatience in parenting. I really,
Right.
really do. But yes, I think that's the danger there is a child that you don't feel like you can then trust your own feelings and you don't feel like you can go to your parent to say those feelings.
Right.
Now, we've discussed OCD on the show before, and the danger of that is we start falling into this moniker from Friends. And if you like a tidy surface and a right angle, then you have OCD. The reality of OCD, yes, there's an element of, for some people, not everybody, that, but the severity can be, my goodness, just horrendous in terms of quality of life. Can you explain what OCD is? And I guess your frustrations about its misuse in media.
Well, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is what OCD is basically the tendency for people to have obsessions, compulsions, and sometimes, most of the time, it's going to come together as both. So the obsessions are intrusive, persistent, unwanted thoughts that the person has. These could be thoughts, images, urges that are then influence certain compulsions, which are behaviors that are engaged in order to satisfy, mitigate, and minimize the anxiety that comes from the obsessions themselves. So it's a very specific process. It cannot just be, oh, I'm very clean as an individual, therefore I have OCD. No, it's, I fear that my parents will die if I don't clean my surface, that it's like shiny. Therefore, I need to clean it so much in order to do that. These are the thoughts that come up. Or sometimes individuals have images of, really horrible things that they could do to other people. And therefore, they engage in certain behaviors to avoid that, thinking that that's going to avoid it.
So really intrusive thoughts.
Really intrusive thoughts. And they're very, very graphic and unwanted thoughts. And those compulsions become as a way to stop it from ever happening. So it's not just tidiness, cleanliness, orderliness. Those are some compulsive behaviors that people might engage in. But we're talking about a complete disruption in the person's life. Like sometimes they end end up not working, or they're unable to work properly. They get fired because they're always late, things like that. So it really causes a lot of disruption in their life. It's not just, okay, I'm taking an extra half an hour to clean my house a little bit more.
Thank you, Dr. Thoraya. So yes, use those words carefully, because there are people who are seriously struggling and suffering with these conditions. Jules has been in touch on 4001 saying, I'm part of a Facebook group for women in Dubai. Every time someone talks negatively about their boyfriend or husband, the comments go wild saying, leave him, he's a narcissist. It drives me mad. I think I might be in this group, actually. If it's got a Spanish-inspired name, then yeah, noted as well. Narcissist. Okay, what is your definition, not just your personally, but your professional definition of a narcissist?
Right. So narcissist is basically the shorter version of narcissistic personality disorder. And again, it's a cluster of symptoms. And these cluster of symptoms, they need to be at least 5 symptoms present over an extremely long period of time, showing up before the age of 18, that we can see that exist in the person's life, and that's causing disruption in the person's significant relationships as well as business relationships and so on and so forth. So with narcissism, we have things, yes, like a tendency to be selfish, a tendency to be self-absorbed and self-involved, but there's also a sense of grandiosity. There's this constant need for admiration from others. There's a manipulative factor to it. There's no remorse, no sense of empathy towards other people. So again, it's a cluster of symptoms. It's not just this person's rude, this person's selfish, they're not thinking of my emotions, therefore they are a narcissist. No. Narcissistic personality disorder is very specific. That person might be selfish in behavior. That person might be unthoughtful, but they are not narcissistic.
So if you have someone who comes into clinic, for example, who says, my mother's a narcissist or my boyfriend's a narcissist, how do you help them make sense of that situation to establish if that really is what you're dealing with?
One of the first things that I do is I say, let's remove the label for a second, because I cannot claim that they they have narcissistic personality disorder. But what I can give them, and what I usually do, is I give them things to read. So I'll give them books that are inspired by psychological concepts that talk about narcissistic personality disordered parents, how that affects their children. And I ask them to read through it and then take notes and write down like which part resonated and which part didn't. And then we can reevaluate. But both ways, I'm still looking at how the person experienced that parent. So I'm not invalidating or minimizing what their experiences are. It's just that diagnosis itself is not necessary for the person to feel validated that their emotions were hurt.
And do you feel that with this rise of mental health awareness and the terms around it, we almost get a bit of a confirmation bias of people going, oh, I know about narcissism now, so I'm going to start recognizing these traits in other people?
Yes, and definitely for those who have been in relationships with individuals with narcissistic personality disorder, the trauma is far worse for them once they leave, because what ends up happening is that not only do they have to pick themselves up from a place of zero, of self-worth, self-doubt, just constant like low confidence, low self-esteem, but also they start to look at everyone as someone that could potentially hurt them.
As a threat.
Right.
How do you? This is a great topic for another day, but briefly in a minute.
Oh, no pressure.
No. But how do you start to rebuild after? And we are going to be talking about trauma after past. After coming out of a relationship with someone who is categorically diagnosed as having a narcissistic personality disorder.
There's a lot of internal work that needs to be done. One of the first things that we start with is awareness of what actually happened versus what they convinced you that happened. And at the same time, we build on learning how to trust yourself, building your confidence, building your self-esteem, and also recognizing that whatever was done to you was not personal against you. It was just their way of knowing how to act with another person.
Dr. Thoraya is with us this afternoon, on hand with insights and advice as we talk about some of the most commonly misused and misunderstood psychological terms. If there's anything that you want some clarity on, by all means, do reach out on 4001. We are talking triggered, toxic, trauma. What does codependent really mean? And are you shy? Do you just want to stay on the sofa, or are you actually antisocial? That's all coming up after your latest headlines here on Dubai Eye 103.8.
Your ARN News
with Etihad Airways.
It is 4:35 and the psychologist is in the building. we're discussing the psychological terms that have become part of common conversation and vernacular, from gaslighting to OCD. What do these terms really mean? Dr. Thoraya, clinical psychologist at the Human Relations Institute and Clinic, on hand to help us understand and use them properly and when appropriate. Now, I sent you my list of words that I wanted to talk about today, just things that really came to mind, Thoraya, and you replied saying, "Add triggered," just within seconds of seeing my WhatsApp. Talk to us about being triggered in psychological terms. What does that really mean?
Yeah, so I would say this is definitely one of my biggest pet peeves when people misuse this. So a trigger and being triggered is usually because there's a stimulus that either awakens or worsens symptoms from a traumatic event or a mental health condition. So when a person says, "I was triggered because of," instead of using "I was annoyed," "I was offended," or "I was frustrated," or I felt angry, they are really doing such a disservice to people who are actually triggered in the proper sense of the term because of different things that have happened to them in their life or because of specific mental health conditions that they have. So something like, for instance, fireworks for a person who's been in a war-torn country, that can be a trigger to that traumatic event for them. Or, for instance, someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder and somebody is like, picking up something with their hands, that could be a trigger for them because of the cleanliness that they may have compulsions towards. So those are triggers.
So when someone is truly triggered, what can the emotional and physiological response be?
So essentially what happens is that your sympathetic nervous system, I was looking for the acronym in my head. The sympathetic nervous system is activated. So that's where you're going to get increase in heart rate, shortness of breath, muscle tension, bladder constriction, just a lot of physiological symptoms that are inducing panic and anxiety and a feeling of perceived threat in that moment. So when you say something like, if I say something to you that you don't like, and you're like, "Oh, that triggers me," essentially what you're saying is that bothers you, but you're just using a word almost in an emotionally manipulative way to try to make me feel. Yes, exactly. You're weaponizing the word triggered in order to make me feel bad for saying something that I may actually, just disagree with you on. And so the word triggered is so overused now, especially on social media, and it's becoming something that is really taking away from the meaning of the word.
And I think that's actually the crux of what we're talking about today, is actually this misuse can, to borrow your phrase, can really do a disservice to people who are having genuine symptoms, genuine conditions. Right. You mentioned trauma there, so let's talk trauma. Because I think the tricky thing about that is we all have our own definitions. We all have our own lived experiences, our own kind of context that we're coming to situations by. And, let's use, I don't know, a car crash as an example. Right. There could be two people who experience that exact same situation who will interpret it, carry it forward or not carry it forward in completely different ways. How do you feel like that word trauma can be misinterpreted and misused?
Well, most people believe that trauma is the event, whereas that's not actually the case. Trauma is the subjective experience of the event. So like you said, a car crash could be traumatic to one person, and then the other person, they walk away and they're okay.
They don't think about it.
Yeah, they don't even think about it, or it doesn't affect them enough to kind of carry that with them. So again, trauma is a subjective experience. So a lot of people will think trauma is, being in war or seeing something horrendous in front of them. That's not trauma. Trauma is how you experience that and whether or not that affects you and is taken with you and then affects different areas of your life.
And presumably there are other aspects to it in terms of how that trauma is dealt with. Right. If you are validated and listened to and you are able to, experience it in I don't want to say a positive way, but if you are supported after an event, that can presumably impact the long-lasting impact of that.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, we have even something called post-traumatic growth. So it's when a person experiences a trauma and then takes from it and then grows and develops from it. So this is possible as well. That's why when we refer to trauma, we're not really talking about what happened, but how you processed what happened.
Dr. Thoraya is with us this afternoon. If you've got any questions for her, you can be, of course, anonymous on the text line 4001. Thoraya, we touched on anxiety earlier and how that can be misused for feeling nervous or feeling worried about a situation. And I think situation is actually really kind of key point there that it can be a day, a moment, and talking about kind of sustained anxiety. What about depression? Because, I mean, I'm someone who's had depression, postnatally, and when someone says, oh, I'm a bit depressed today, and I'm like, I know what you're saying. However,
it's not depression.
It's not depression.
Right.
Can you give us some kind of parameters? And again, the scale of severity and the kind of context around how someone might experience depression can vary so much.
Of course.
So it's hard to pinpoint as such. But when you're talking about clinical depression that is diagnosed, it is treated, whether it is through, CBT or through medication or through talk therapy. What are you talking about?
Well, when we talk about clinical depression, usually we're talking about major depressive disorder. If we just start with that one has a cluster of 9 symptoms, and you basically need 5 over a period of at least 2 weeks to about 6 months that you've experiencing this, and it's creating dysfunction in your life in at least 2 areas of your life. And those symptoms are not sadness. It's not just sadness, therefore you are depressed. That's not how that works. When I teach my interns, use the acronym SIGI CAPS. So when you think of depression, the 9 symptomologies are SIGI CAPS. So S is for disruption in sleep. So that's either sleeping too much or sleeping too little. I is decrease in interest. G is feelings of guilt and hopelessness. E is loss in energy. Oh, okay, where am I?
Come on, teacher.
SIGI CAPS. C is concentration and focus difficulties. A is ironic. A is appetite dysfunction. P is psychomotor retardation or agitation. And then S is suicidality and deep and dark thoughts. And then on top of that, you have the depressed mood. So essentially,
Crikey.
that is only the one symptom that is consistent. But you have 9 symptoms that we need at least 5 of those in order for you to be clinically diagnosed as depressed. So when we use the word depressed for sadness, we are really misusing that word.
Okay, thank you for that. Do genuinely appreciate it. So I've got a bit of a busy calendar this week. I've kind of booked myself in for like three things in a row is a lot for me. 3 nights out, it's a lot. And I was like, I'm feeling a little bit antisocial this week. And I was like, no, it's not. I just want to watch The Bear season 2 on Disney Plus. That's really what I want to do. When we're talking about someone being genuinely antisocial and that impacting their life beyond just wanting to stay on the sofa, what are we talking about?
So I actually would never use the word antisocial because when we talk about antisocial psychologically, we're talking about antisocial personality disorder, which is the DSM replacement for psychopathy and sociopathy.
Okay.
So to just stay away from that word as much as possible.
Use carefully.
Yes.
I think we've got time for one more. Would you like to talk about boundaries or being codependent?
Oh,
Your choice.
Come on now.
It's going to be boundaries.
It's going to be boundaries. It has to be boundaries.
Please write a book about your love of boundaries. Now, where do you think there are myths and misconceptions about the phrase about boundaries, Dr. Throyer?
Well, I think a lot of people believe that boundaries are like building walls, which is not the case. Because when you build a wall around yourself, you're kind of isolated in the middle. Whereas building boundaries is about allowing people in, but just different people have different distances between how much you allow them into your life based on their consistency and the trust that you have in their behavior towards you and the respect. Exactly. Yeah. And so boundaries is not about saying no. That's not what a boundary is. It's just about recognizing that you exist in any relationship and your presence and your essence is equally important to everybody else's. It's not you before anyone else and it's not anyone else before you. It's both of us together.
And then we've talked about this before, and I heard a podcast a couple of years ago which was talking about boundaries and how boundaries, as you're saying, it's not a wall, it can be a meeting place.
Right.
And that can be a meeting place of understanding of this is my expectation of you and that this is your expectation of me and this is how we can happily move forward together with this level of understanding. Where I think it's misused, and I see this a lot on social media, is boundaries, and that just means you can be mean to people and say no, and that means you're a strong, confident person.
Right. Or it's used as if you want to be my friend, this is my boundary. Don't ever do this again. No, you don't get to control people like that. That's not what that is. What a boundary is you communicating what you like and what you don't like. And whether or not the person respects that is up to the other person. You don't get to dictate how people behave with you. However, you do have the right to communicate it. And if someone disagrees with you, they're not disrespecting your boundary. They're just not agreeing with it. And therefore, they can walk away and you can walk away. But boundaries are not set in a way that you must do this or else. Those are threats. Those are not boundaries. That's not really respectful. And that's a big part of boundaries, is that I respect you and I respect myself. That's what a boundary is.
I'm really glad we had this chat today. It was interesting. Yesterday we were talking about A-level results and how there's an expectation for some disappointing grades next week. We had Heather Harries on, education expert, and I was asking her, like, what's trending when it comes to university? And she's like, so many people going to study psychology.
Right.
So I don't know if we can point to that being a post-pandemic thing or, again, increased conversations around mental health. So the more correct, clear information out there, the better. Dr. Thuraiya, a pleasure as ever. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen.
You can find Dr. Thuraiya at the Human Relations Institute and Clinic. If you want her details, just send me the word Dr. T and I will send you a link. We've got some Coldplay for you now here on Dubai Eye 103.8, and I'll be telling you what is in store for you after 5 o'clock. You've, of course, got Off Script coming your way here on Dubai Eye 103.8.